me and I don't know why. One will explode in the midnight sky. I got rage in my cage and it's coming of age, but the key seems to be locked inside. From the rat race to the tomb, yeah, I refuse to join that queue.
Let me start first with a very simple dichotomy. And this is not going to be a rhetorical question. You can answer, and I may be able to see a few hands going up in the room. How many people in this room believe in democracy? Can somebody in the back of the room tell me whether or not we have a majority here? Do we have a majority? Okay, we have a majority of small d Democrats, okay? Only going to be 2 questions right now. Second question, how many people in the room believe in capitalism? Do we have a majority in capitalists here? I don't think we have a majority. Do we have a majority? We don't have a majority. This is most interesting. I've never had that result before when I've done this. I can improvise off of this one. Actually, it's not very hard. In fact, it's actually not very surprising. For those of you who raised your hand twice, who both said that you're a small d Democrat and a capitalist, I hereby will pronounce you to be a bona fide schizophrenic. For those of you who raised your hand on one of the 2 questions and were sort of like doing this with the second one, you are schizophrenics in recovery. You decide whether or not you're a bona fide schizophrenic or a schizophrenic in recovery. And the reason you're schizophrenic is the fact that you are rational. It is rational to be both a believer in democracy and a believer in capitalism. Now, if capitalism has bitten you in the bum for 4 years in a row, it is quite logical that maybe you be having second doubts. I understand that. But actually, in general, I tend to get rooms full of people who raise their hand to both. I call them schizophrenic, but actually they're rational. Let me explain. This is hugely important, fundamental economics, as David keeps telling me that we have to come back to understand civilized society. Democracy and capitalism are governance systems. But at their foundation, they're antithetical. Democracy is inherently a socialist system, the most extreme socialist system. One person, one vote. How more egalitarian can you get? One person, one vote. All created equal under the law. A fair system. A just system, an ideal system. Some would call it a holy system. You feel like you're in church, huh? How could you not raise your hand in favor of this? Justice, equality, dignity, all this sort of stuff. That's a governance system. But it's also fundamentally socialist. Now, let's think in terms of capitalism. What is the rule of governance in capitalism? Is it one person, one vote? No, not at all. It is €1, one vote, or $1, one vote. Let's call it one monetary unit, one vote. Capitalism is a cumulative voting system. Want to understand what a cumulative voting system is? I'll translate for you. A cumulative voting system is the more euros you have, the more votes you have. There's nothing egalitarian about capitalism at all. Your entrance ticket to the voting booth in capitalism is how many votes do you have? How many monetary units do you have? Very simple example of that for you. When you are going to go to the United States or to Asia and you walk onto the plane, what determines whether or not you take a right on the 747 or a left on the 747? Ego? That's a new one. That's a new one for me. I'm not sure how that fits into the slot. Last time I was on such a flight, it was not a democratic process whether you took a right or a left when you walked on. It was a capitalist process. You had to buy your way to the big seats, right? That's the way it still works here in this country. Democracy is not involved. You buy yourself into the big seats. Now, it's a practical matter. You can have this funny currency called miles. But that's a cumulative voting system too, right? If you want one of the big seats, you have to have a lot of miles. Not just a few miles, but a lot of miles. So they're very different systems. Why do they coexist? How do they coexist? And when there's friction between them, how to resolve it? Those are the questions before us, not just in this country, but globally. Democracy and capitalism are a holy marriage of incompatibility. Not all the words I just said. Holy marriage of incompatibility. They're supposed to be constantly in a struggle. And what makes them holy? It's very simple. They need each other. They need each other. And the tie that binds them is called the rule of law. Capitalism can do many things. What capitalism can't do is establish a credible rule of law that is accepted by free people. Because if you ask a room full of capitalists to design a rule of law, what would it evolve to? You get the best justice that money can buy. Capitalists would say, no, it wouldn't devolve to that, and they would be lying not just to you, but to themselves. Because fundamentally, that is the tenet of capitalism, is justice is defined by how much money you have. Capitalists and the capitalist system can't function without a rule of law, because capitalism requires enforceable contracts. You cannot have a system of enforceable contracts when your standing before the rule of law is based upon how many euros you have in your pocket. So while capitalists will curse and bemoan government, politics all day long, at the end of the day, they have to be married to a democratic process to have the one thing that they have to have, called an enforceable, credible, believable rule of law. So actually, capitalists need democracy. Conversely, democracy needs capitalists a lot. Capitalists are very good at efficiency. They couldn't come up with a system of law that would be credible. But away from that, capitalist and the capitalist system is founded on efficiency. Decision-making is quite clear. Like, for instance, when you get on that plane, we don't have a referendum to decide whether or not you go right or left. Ego determined. It's you show your ticket. Your ticket says right, your ticket says left. It's an efficient process. I sat on both nonprofit boards and for-profit boards. It's very different. If you have 51% of the common shareholding in a company, the board's not a democratic process. And in fact, there is a market price for 51 versus 49. That's called a control premium. So actually, capitalism is a very efficient system and actually has the incentive to get rich and has the duty to go broke when you're boneheaded. It's a very clear-cut system bounded upon risk and reward, payoff, and pay up. It's a very efficient system. Now, does it have flaws? Of course it does. But as a fundamental premise, it's based upon incentives. And incentives that are founded on the notion we're not all created equal. Now, I've actually sat and actually do sit on a couple nonprofit boards where we don't operate on the capitalist principle, but operate on the democratic principle of one person, one vote. Highly inefficient. Maybe some of you have sat on such a board in your time at church or some charity you're involved in. And I'll just relate a story not too long ago. I was sitting on a committee of a board that was throwing the annual gala of fundraising for a very important charity that I believe in. And there are 3 or 4 of us that effectively will be underwriting the event. We're putting up the bucks. The committee spent 45 minutes of a 3-hour meeting debating the menu. Why did we spend 45 minutes of a 3-hour meeting debating the menu? I would have never tolerated that in the capitalist world, because it was a board of inclusion. And Mrs. Jones, who puts $5 in the offering plate every Sunday, had an opinion about the menu. We heard her out. And I love Mrs. Jones. I'm not criticizing her. It was highly inefficient, but it was a sense of fairness that we were all created. This was a church event, obviously, you can tell. So capitalism brings efficiency. Democracy brings a rule of law. That's why it's a holy marriage grounded in conflict, because they're bringing each something the other can't do. Democracy cannot bring efficiency. I've heard governments accused of many, many things. Efficiency is not one of them. If anybody wants the stage to make the case that governments are efficiency, David, can we give them 5 minutes? I don't think we'll have a long queue here. They're not efficient. Capitalism is efficient, but democracy in government brings legitimacy, founded on democracy and one person, one vote, and that reality that no one is above the law. Which is why in the United States, and I guess in this country too, periodically we as society need to have rich capitalists have their pinstripes changed from vertical to horizontal and be paraded across our television screens with their hands behind their back. We need a visible reminder that no one is above the law. So when I see this spectacle, and it happens in all sorts of countries, and people bemoan the sad state of affairs, actually I get a sense of contentment because it means the system is working. That yes, democracy respects the efficiency of capitalism, the growth of capitalism, the prosperity of capitalism, the opportunity of capitalism. But there are limits to greed because we do believe in the concept of one person, one vote. And actually in the United States, our whole election right now is essentially about how we combine the two. Mr. Obama actually believes in capitalism. I know sometimes Mr. Romney doesn't want to acknowledge that perhaps Mr. Obama believes in capitalism, but he does. The Democratic Party believes in capitalism. Conversely, I think the Republican Party actually does believe in democracy. I actually do think that's the case, that Mr. Romney and his party do believe in the principle of one person, one vote. They do believe in the principle of a safety net. They do believe, though this one is a tricky one, in the concept that the rich have a more than proportionate duty to take care of the poor. I actually believe that the two parties in America both believe in democracy and capitalism. It's a matter of degree, which is why I'm actually reasonably optimistic about the United States in the years ahead, even though when you look at the election, you effectively, if you wanted to be a cartoonist or a comedian, can say, it is election between socialism and feudalism. There are elements of that, but it really isn't an election between socialism and feudalism. It's about how to balance the principles of efficiency and equity. And what has happened, and obviously here I'm going to be on my own hobby horse for a second, what's happened in the last 10, 20, and 30 years is we've put too much emphasis on efficiency and too little interest on equity. Income and wealth is more maldistributed in the United States now than it's been at any time in 80 years. I think our economy is going to grow and do reasonably well in the years ahead, independent who's in the White House, because the property market's turning and we've healed from our crisis. But I think the key issue when we think in terms of the United States, using my framework of the holy, unholy marriage, or the holy marriage with inherent conflict and squabbling day to day between democracy and capital, is what kind of character is our economy going to have? Getting back to my fourth step that I was starting out with, a fearless and thorough moral inventory. Our society is doing that. We are not happy, joyous, and free about it, but we're actually doing that. Let me come to your country and this region, and then we will have David come back up, and we'll talk about anything that you want to talk about. We'll talk about anything you want to talk about now. And when I talk about democracy and capitalism for Euroland, broadly defined, it actually is a three-dimensional process. In the United States, pretty much two-dimensional. Because we, in the United States, while we have 50 states, which is hugely important that we actually have 50 states when you think in terms of forecasting the election, because we have electoral college and all that sort of stuff. But actually, I can talk comfortably about democracy and capitalism in two-dimension space for the United States. For your land, it's three-dimension space. It's democracy, it's capitalism, it's also sovereignty of nations. So the thorough and fearless moral inventory that's going on in Euroland is a three-dimensional prospect. Capitalists are creditors. That simple. Capitalists have capital. They put capital to work. Capitalists are rich people. Sorry, I'm a capitalist. Capitalists have money. They are creditors. Democracies borrow money. Nothing inherently wrong about that. Because if the capitalists are the rich people with money and democracies want to redistribute money, they have to borrow it from the guy who has it. Pretty straightforward sort of stuff. Pay him interest, maybe. So essentially you have capitalists who are creditors, democracies who are debtors. But then you have the third dimension here in Euroland is sovereignty of nations. In the United States, we don't have to deal with that because we're one nation of 50 states. We are the United States. We have monetary union. We have political union. We make decisions collectively, and we're making one next week, about the balance between capitalism and democracy. Here in Euroland, it is infinitely more complex because individual countries, excluding a particular one, don't get to make sovereign decisions about how do we want to trade off between the efficiency of capitalism and the equity of democracy. The efficiency of capitalism, in many respects, is founded on the notion if you owe me money, the court system will make you pay me back. That's efficient. You owe me money, you pay me back. I lend you money to buy a car. You don't pay me back, I repossess your car. That's what capitalism is about. Here in Euroland, however, the creditor is not we, the people, collectively. The creditor is sovereign states. The borrower are sovereign states. So if I can sum up in a nutshell what's going on in your land right now, and pardon me for putting it bluntly, it's whether or not debtor countries, you are one, you know that, whether or not debtor countries are willing to sacrifice their democratic sovereignty on the throne of capitalism. Remember, we got three things working here. You got to try to solve a problem. What is going to give? Is the dictate of capitalism, meaning that the creditor sets the terms, going to win? That's called austerity and punishment. That's called capitalism. If I lend you money for you to buy a car, you don't pay me back, I repossess your car and you walk. Got it? Straightforward. You walk. I get your car back because you didn't pay the money back. That's called capitalism. Do we do that? You walk. That's worshiping at the shrine of capitalism. If you're going to worship at the shrine of capitalism, you have to check your coat of democratic sovereignty at the door. Conversely, if you say, no, I will not go into that house of worship called capitalism, I will not take off my coat of democratic sovereignty, then you have to deal with the consequences, which is that the creditor may never lend to you again. Emerging market countries have dealt with this equation forever. To me, the record of history is pretty clear. When push comes to shove, when you have to choose, between blind worship at the house of capitalism and the dignity of self-determination, and you go for self-determination and free yourself from the shackles of debt, then ultimately it won't be you that is repenting. It will be the capitalist coming back offering you fresh money. That is the history of the emerging markets over many times. I know I have devolved into preaching, but I feel like preaching tonight. This whole topic of democracy and capitalism is very near and dear to my heart. And it's infinitely more difficult for me when I'm on this side of the pond than at home, because you have to put in the third variable called sovereignty of nations. And as I look in the years ahead at prospects for Euroland, I'm not nearly so sanguine as I am on the United States. On the United States, it's a two-dimensional chess game. We'll figure it out. Obviously, I'm an Obama man, and obviously, I think that my taxes should go up because, remember, I am, quote-unquote, in the rich category. I can pay a little bit more, and I'm happy, as Mr. Obama says, to pay a little bit more. I'm willing to pay my disproportionate share of the freight for democracy because my country is my treasure. So actually, it's not too hard to come to a non-political, seasoned solution to what's going on in the United States. It's really a small beer problem compared to Euroland, which is a very large beer problem. Because it's not just democracy and capitalism, an inherent tension. There's sovereignty of nations as a third layer. And I, quite frankly, don't see a smooth transition. But what I wanted to put on the table to now is the framework, the triad, starting with the duo and then moving to the triad. This is where you are. So if you want to think in terms of things being better, you have to think in terms of what church matters more to you in the context of what the long arc of history says. And I believe strongly, in the words of Martin Luther King, the long arc of history points and bends towards justice. Thank you very much.
Paul McCully, ladies and gentlemen.